Welcome to Genius or Junk with me, your host, Jim Fowler, where we invite a guest to debate whether an item is doomed to oblivion or it belongs in the genius vault. Only the most deserving innovations will stand the test of time. But do you agree with their choices? This summer will mark the 85th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, when the Luftwaffe was in deadly combat with the RAF across the skies of southern England. And to discuss these genius or junk items on this momentous event is Stephen Williams, an author and historian who's written a book on ingenious inventions that's changed the world. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to chatting to you about this Battle of Britain special.
Why don't you introduce yourself and before we get onto your genius items?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. So I went to university, didn't study history, but once I left, I began researching because I've always been struck by people, particularly ordinary people, that have gone on to do extraordinary things and change the course of human progress. Having researched this for probably about 15 years, I decided that I was going to write a book. And the reason for that came about was twofold, really. One, because I thought there might be a book out there that covered not just inventions, but broader innovations. So concepts, theories, ideas that really had started in Britain and then gone on to change history. But I couldn't find one. And so I thought perhaps I could put one together myself. And I decided to do that during COVID. There wasn't much else you could do, sort of finish work. But what I wanted to do was really try and target an audience of people that wouldn't normally pick up a history book. So I tried to, in this very short attention span world that we live in, I thought I'm going to keep the chapters between 500 and 700 words so you can read them in about 6 minutes. And in doing that, you can get an understanding for this innovation, its background, the context, and why it's still relevant today. And I was going to self-publish it, but I actually sent off to a few publishers in the UK. I was pleased that a few of them came back, and I eventually signed with Pen and Sword Books, and we published it at the early part of last year.
Fantastic. And with these some of these ingenious items, have they got a bit of a military bent to them? Or was it just a broad spectrum?
So some of them have a military bent. Some of them are, it goes across really 9 genres, from culture, society, engineering, medicine. And we're then also looking at things like literature, sport innovations. It's absolutely fascinating how many sports have started here in Britain. Philosophy, because we've had some great philosophers here, whether that be looking at people like Adam Smith and free markets. And then also as well, what the book was trying to target as well was linking them together. And actually, what have so many of these people that have done these quite remarkable things actually got in common? And I was trying to link that up at the end of the book.
Fantastic. So if we rewind the clock then back to sort of July 1940, so we're looking at sort of the genius or junk items from maybe that momentous sort of battle and campaign. So you've got some quite interesting selections, and the two that you've selected are very much intertwined and kind of feed off each other. So would you like to sort of introduce your genius item that you'd like to put forward for that Battle of Britain campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. So the item I'd look to put forward is radar. And the reason I'd like to put that forward is because I think that was a pivotal technology that not just changed the course of that battle, but I would argue changed the course of the world, in conjunction, of course, with other events. But we could be looking, even today, at a very different world had radar not been invented.
So let's give us some context. Because the actual concept of radar was around by sort of like World War II, was kind of been around for a while. Some people more successful than others. A lot of different countries competing to try and invent it. But why do you think it was so important to this specific time period? And also, maybe can you give us a bit of context of what the Battle of Britain was about?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, radar, and I'll just define that because so it stands for radio detection and ranging. And if we really try and trace this back, and I think with all inventions, you find that there is quite a long history behind them. And actually, there are certain inflection points where you'll identify an acceleration in that invention, in either its use or how quickly it advances in terms of its technological understanding. So with radar, you can probably trace its origins back, I would say, to probably the 1880s, so around 1884, 1886. And we had various engineers that were putting together equations to explain the behavior of electromagnetic waves. That was really being done at the forefront, really in Britain and Germany at the time. But as a technology, radar was very much on the back burner for probably the better part of 50 years after that. And the reason being is that there wasn't enough time or money being put in to really this development.
I mean, should we actually say what radar actually is, the concept of what's going on? So what maybe should we explain, how does a radar work?
Yeah, so you'll find, and this is where it's moved over time. So what radar started out as very different to radar that we have that keeps many of us safe on a daily basis in the modern world. But it's essentially electromagnetic waves that will go out and they will then identify metallic objects. They will bounce off them and come back. And what that enables us to do is determine, based on the speed, is how far away a certain object is. Now, of course, the importance of this, and referring back to the Battle of Britain, which was fought over the skies of southern England in the summer of 1940 between the Royal Air Force of Britain and the Luftwaffe of Nazi Germany, was that really what Britain needed to identify was enemy aircraft coming into our space, into our skies. And we needed to ascertain three things: where they were, how fast they were flying at, and what altitude they were. If we contextualize this a little bit, and if I take one step back as to why radar is and was so important, we'd obviously, during the First World War, many of the air forces, and in fact the RAF only came into existence in 1918, so at the end of World War I, aircraft was at the periphery of the militaries of Germany, France and Britain. They were becoming, as the war went on, you were seeing a significant increase in its use. Initially, it was for a lot of observation, trying to identify where enemy positions were. You then had various attempts at trying to bomb various cities using types of aircraft. But what was evident was at the end of World War I that something was changing about Britain's defences. So if you think about Britain, ever since really the continental drift of Britain from mainland Europe about 10,000 years ago, if Britain was going to be invaded, whether we talk about the Spanish Armada or we talk about the Napoleonic Wars, it was only really coming from one way. It was coming via the English Channel and the sea. But having air forces changed that completely, in that if we were to be invaded, we could have observation of a big fleet coming across the channel. It wouldn't give us much time, but it would certainly give us enough time that we would be in a position to mount some form of defence if we hadn't already got one. But with aircraft travelling at hundreds of miles an hour, suddenly we could find that Britain could be under attack in a matter of minutes. And therefore, we needed to find a way to identify this quickly. We then needed to find a way in which, once we'd identified what was coming across the channel, how we could disseminate that information and then utilise it. And of course, in World War II, we needed to get that through to Fighter Command. They could then scramble the pilots at the appropriate airfields to get them airborne as quickly as possible.
So how, practically, how did radar help sort of turn this tide? What was the practical system? How was it implemented to actually, as we know from history, keep the Luftwaffe at bay?
So what was absolutely key in radar was being able to determine where the aircraft was coming from, how quickly it was travelling, how many of them there were, and how high they were flying at. And very quickly from that, we could determine what their probable target was. And we could work out where our forces, where the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, would be able to intercept them. This is probably what's most important about the development of radar over time is that actually when you're in the sky and you're flying a plane, if you're even told within a couple of miles where the enemy is, that can still be like trying to find maybe not a needle in a haystack, but it's certainly like trying to find something that's very small in quite a big area. And that's assuming, of course, that the skies are clear. If it's somewhat nebulous, or it's cloudy, it's foggy, or perhaps even it's at nighttime, trying to identify them, even within a 3-mile radius, is a very challenging thing to do. And so the accuracy of radar that enabled the Royal Air Force to be able to intercept the Luftwaffe and know where they were going, and then, of course, as well, be able to chase them off, and in many cases, harry them away from their target destination, was pivotal. Without radar, it would have been an almost impossible job to A, know they were coming, and B, know where they were headed. Of course, look, Britain had made other plans as well. So we had the Observer Corps, which were designed with the naked eye to attempt to identify as early as possible the type of aircraft, the number of aircraft, and again, the altitude they were flying at. But that was nowhere near as powerful as having radar and being able to then utilize that information, bring it back to a receiver station, interpret it, take it to Central Command, and then, of course, issue instructions on where the Air Force needed to go. I think it's very difficult to underplay how important radar was in enabling Britain to defend itself. And if you think what Britain had to do, it didn't have to win. It had to survive. It had to make sure that its Air Force was still functional. And of course, getting the Air Force airborne was pivotal in doing that, because the success that the Royal Air Force had, particularly by, I would say, the middle of August, drove Nazi Germany to change its plans, which ultimately ended up being catastrophic, because they were targeting the airfields. And they knew that if we can knock the RAF out while it's on the ground, or just simply stop them getting airborne, that ultimately we will get control of the skies. But because they believed that the RAF was doing better than perhaps it really was. That's not in terms of how many Luftwaffe were being downed, but simply in the fact that they were still sortie after sortie, attack after attack, able to send fighters up to defend Britain. They then decided that they were going to attack the morale of Britain, which meant bombing and attacking the cities, particularly London, as well as others. And that was to great relief to Fighter Command, because, of course, it relieved the attacks that were going on the airfield. And whilst they were bombing cities and towns and the horrors that went on during the Blitz, what it meant was we were still able to get our aircraft airborne, and we could know where they were going, and we could still continue to defend ourselves.
But then, and how surprising then was it, considering that radar was, the Germans were at the forefront of its inception, that they didn't just go, oh, hang on a minute, why don't we just bomb the radar stations? Were they just completely unaware, or?
So I think it's fair to say they were aware. I don't think they were aware of just how important it was. And they did target some of the stations that were being used. That was a part of what they were doing, but it was never a key element of what they were doing. And of course, as not so much the Battle of Britain, but as the war went on, we had other developments that came in, which meant that radar could become much smaller, like the cavity magnetron, which actually could be built onto a plane or a ship and was mobile. And so that really enhanced and pushed forwards the capabilities of not just the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, but actually the entire Allied operation. But it was something that Britain, and this is where I would argue that many ways, for all of the mistakes that were made in World War II on all sides, but particularly I think we look at Britain being underprepared, very much undercooked at the start of 1939. But I would argue that Churchill and others got the big calls right because we lost a lot of battles, but we still ended up winning the war. And I would argue that one of the big calls was investing quite early in radar and that early detection of oncoming aircraft from our enemies.
And I suppose also we need to sort of bring in the context of what was happening in the summer of 1940. I mean, so if you can explain, where was Germany at this point and how was Britain threatened, basically? I mean, was invasion actually on the cards?
I'll take one step back within this. So obviously Britain and France had declared war on Germany in September 1939 upon the invasion of Poland. We then had a period that was known as the phony war, because there wasn't an awful lot that was happening. Germany and Russia had signed a peace act, but we'd had several months where nothing really happened. Then in spring 1940, we had this huge Nazi offensive where they swept across multiple countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, they then got Norway, and then pushed on into northern France. And what they had done was quite remarkable, the speed at which they had been able to really devastate the militaries of the Netherlands and Belgium and in northern France. But the British had observed one thing in particular, which had really, really hit home. And that was that the Luftwaffe, upon invasion, immediately targeted the air forces of the Netherlands, Belgium, of France, because they realized that by bombing the aircraft on the ground and also bombing the runways, that they could gain not just aerial superiority, but they would gain total control of the skies. And once you've got total control of the skies, it makes your infantry a hell of a lot more powerful.
And at this point, we'll obviously come to radar and how important it was. But I mean, what sort of numbers are we talking about? I mean, was the Luftwaffe, were sort of equal parity?
No, so the Luftwaffe had significantly larger numbers. So there's two parts to this. They had, in terms of raw numbers, they had significantly more planes and they had significantly more men at their disposal to fly those planes. They also, as well, were very high off the back of so many victories and the speed in which they had been able to push across. One thing they didn't have in their favour was that they were fighting, if you will, to use a sporting analogy, away from home. And so every time they were coming across, they only had a certain amount of time whereby they could stay across England. Every time they had a plane that was shot down, they typically would lose the pilot as well. Whereas unlike with Britain, we were fighting the vast majority of this over the channel, that you could find that many of the pilots that bailed out were in fact actually able to parachute down to safety. And not that you would want this, but you could well find yourself shot down in the morning and back up pretty quickly, maybe if not the afternoon, but the following day. The one thing I would say about having the channel between Britain and continental Europe was it did give us crucial minutes, and it was only minutes, of time for us to detect the oncoming enemy aircraft and alert us to the fact that the numbers that they were coming in and where they were. And throughout the course of the war, radar became far more accurate.
And also, it's not a sort of a problem that the Germans just want to neutralise the RAF just to take them out of the war. I mean, we're literally under threat of invasion. I mean, there was Operation Sea Lion, and I suppose with that, I mean, this is like a serious attempt to invade.
So I hypothesize that this battle, the Battle of Britain, was the most important battle in the 20th century. And that is not by any means to suggest that there were not many important battles across the First World War, across, let's say, things like the Vietnam War, those that have gone on later, and particularly many of the battles of the Second World War that were incredibly bloody. But at this moment in time, and let's look at the summer of 1940, Britain was alone as the only democratic nation left in Europe that was still willing and able to resist Nazi Germany. Now, if, let's say, the Battle of Britain had perhaps been won by Nazi Germany, I suspect that there still would not have been an invasion. It's possible that there would have been. But if you look at how difficult D-Day ended up being and how much planning went into that and things like the big failures of the Dieppe raids, I would suggest that even as unprepared as Britain was, a seaborne invasion at scale would have been incredibly difficult to do, let alone make it successful. However, what it almost certainly would have done was it would have brought Britain to the negotiating table. We would have been, I would suspect, have almost certainly had to have some kind of dishonourable peace deal that would have been severely in favour of Nazi Germany. And of course, what that would then mean is that at that point, the Nazis would no longer have been fighting a war on two fronts. They would have been able to then focus exclusively on the Eastern Front and turned all of their attention to the Soviet Union. Now, that may have ended in a different result, but even if it hadn't, the Americans would no longer have been able, post Pearl Harbor, to get involved in the battle in Europe because the Nazis certainly would not have allowed them to have come over en masse in the way that they did. So the chances of there being a D-Day would be unlikely. We probably, and almost certainly, would not have been able to have launched any successful campaign in North Africa because we would have been in some kind of a peace deal. We could be looking at a completely different world today had the Battle of Britain not been a decisive British victory. And I think we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the men that not just fought and flew in those planes, but that were supporting and that had the courage of their conviction. And I don't know if any of our listeners have ever actually flown in a Spitfire, but I tell you what, you need one hell of a strong constitution to be able to go up in those. And actually, that is why I truly believe that it was the most important battle of the 20th century, because so much could have changed, and indeed so much would have changed, even if the Nazis had not tried an invasion. We would almost certainly have had to enter some kind of a negotiation where we would not have been doing so from any sort of position of strength.
Fantastic. And I think you've sort of very eloquently demonstrated why radar should be in the Genius Vault. But then also, as you just mentioned there, you know, the pivot to radar was quite early. And I think that brings us on to maybe the item that you've selected for the junk pile of history, which I know we've already decided is maybe a bit harsh, but it kind of brings us nicely onto that. So would you like to introduce the item that you'd like to see? Well, unfortunately, is on the junk pile of history. It's not even going to put it there. It's already there.
Indeed, yeah. So it's the acoustic mirrors. They're called a few things, actually. They can be called sound mirrors as well. And the acoustic mirror was, if you will, it was an early form of radar.
So should we just describe to the listeners, what is an acoustic mirror?
So an acoustic mirror is a huge block of cement. And they came in many shapes and many sizes. They're along the southern coast, some part on the eastern coast of England, but the southern coast of England in particular. And they were designed typically in a concave shape. And there was a microphone placed in front of them. And you had typically an individual who was there in all elements, in all weathers, to listen to the microphone to sounds that would be picking up and bouncing off any aircraft coming in. So it was essentially doing the same thing as what radar became. But the difference here was it was, in many instances, less reliable in some ways because you could get all sorts of interference, not least because of the weather. But also as well, it was nowhere near as advanced in giving us the bigger picture of information that we had. But for its time, it was incredibly advanced. And so actually it's with a bit of a heavy heart, I would call it a junk item, because it served its purpose incredibly well. Basically from the end of the First World War, when we had a real understanding of how important air forces were going to be going forwards. And of course, even during the 1920s, when we weren't really that concerned about there being a second Great War as the first one was known. By the early 1930s, and certainly by the mid-1930s in German rearmament, we knew that we needed to have this knowledge and this information in a timely manner. But the acoustic mirrors were there as almost the first line of defense, because again, coming back to what we can observe and we can see, and if you go down to some parts of Kent, I believe you can see France on a sunny day, but you can only see about 50 feet in front of you on a foggy day. So the point was, we were very much at the mercy of the elements, and we were also very much at the mercy of people being able to have the visibility to see. So these acoustic mirrors were very important. And actually, talking about how things go full circle, I've noticed that they have appeared in many forms of artwork, in many music videos, and actually in many fashion shoots. So I think that these, I guess, if you will, they found a place in the modern world. Certainly not what they were originally intended for. They were a huge network that was building on actually technology and frankly just an understanding of acoustics that we have known for thousands of years. And if I was to put it into perhaps the times of the Romans or even the Greeks, they had amphitheaters, and if you look at the shape of them, they're in horseshoes, and they are designed that in that concave way for acoustics. And it's having this understanding of sound and how it travels that, as a power, if you will, was harnessed by these acoustic mirrors, but on a much greater scale. Instead of us trying to enhance the sound in a small space for an amphitheater, actually, the acoustic mirror was trying to harness the power of sound over tens of miles to enable us to defend our island nation.
And so, why did they fail? I mean, what was it? Was this radar more reliable, or was it because, you know, I've read somewhere that the planes were getting so quick that it wouldn't have mattered, or, you know, what was the reason?
Yeah, so there's two probably interesting strands to that. I would say that rather than failing, they were simply supplanted by a better technology. Without question, engines were becoming more powerful, planes were becoming faster, and therefore it was evident, and this is why Britain decided to invest time in developing radar, was that we became aware as a nation, or at least those within the Air Force became aware of how important the accuracy, the reliability, and the speed of that information was going to be. If you will, it was the switch almost from analog to digital. And that's really where we pivoted away from these acoustic mirrors into radar and looking at it from a different perspective. But the acoustic mirrors served a very strong purpose. And it was an idea, a concept that we ultimately built upon, because whilst radar in and of itself was something that not only defended Britain and then obviously was implemented across the Allied forces, and indeed actually was also used by the Axis as well. The radar that we understand today, we're trying to do the same thing, but we're just able to do it in a much more sophisticated way. If you will, the acoustic mirrors were somewhat primitive, but they served a very important purpose.
But also, was there a legacy as well? Because obviously these were designed to be interconnected as a chain, which then we saw going forward, you know, on that summer in 1940.
With the home chain.
Exactly.
Indeed. And that's exactly it. And the whole point was that they were not, they could operate in isolation, but they were also designed to be utilized in common with each other. And that's exactly what happened with the home chain, and the reason that we had this defense. Because if you think about it, the assumption was and has been for a long time that if you're going to launch an invasion, you're probably going to do it at the point where the body of water is smallest, which would naturally be something like Dover to Calais.
Well, I mean, I think even though the acoustic mirror, it might have been supplanted by radar, I mean, we can still see it in today. You see, if you watch Spring Watch, you'll see them, the tweeters when they're listening to the microphones with the parabolic concave dishes, and then you have also the American football. The guys on the side, listening to the huddle with those like whisper microphones and stuff. So I suppose the ones that we do see today, there's so many different designs. You can show that it was a bit of a work in progress.
Hugely, it was a work in progress, and it was actually scrambled together in many ways because Britain needed to have this defence system in place very, very quickly. Post the end of World War One, we needed to have those aerial defences, and this was an integral part of that. But what I would argue is, in terms of its purpose, if you think about technology across almost any sphere, you find that it only lasts for a certain period of time. Like, I'll give you another example. In my lifetime, and I'm in my early 40s, so I've consumed music via an LP, via a cassette, a CD. I think I had a mini disc at one point. I then had an iPod. I mean, what an idea that was. But even that only lasted for maybe 10, 15 years before we all started streaming everything. And that's in my lifetime. That's 6 different ways of consuming music. And all of those technologies are superb in their own right, but they've just been overtaken by something else. And it's the same with the acoustic mirror. And actually, it's a testament to it that it is still, in other guises, still employed today.
Fantastic. Well, they're 2 fantastically well-argued items from that, momentous summer, I'd say 85 years ago. And I think the radar definitely has got to go in the Genius vaults. I mean, we're still using it today, so that's a given. And, like we said, I think the acoustic mirror might be on the junk pile of history, but maybe reluctantly, its legacy still lives on. So
Absolutely. And one thing I'd say is I don't think everybody... I do feel somewhat saddened that I've put the acoustic mirror into the junk pile, but I suppose, like many things, it does get overtaken. But I would just say one final thing on radar. We don't always quite realise how important radar is in keeping us safe every single day of our lives, in that the military use that it had. By the mid-1950s, at least in America, people were starting to travel. It wasn't just the domain of the military and the wealthy. It was becoming more of the middle classes were using it. By the 1960s and certainly by the 1970s across Europe, there were lots and lots of planes in the sky from a commercial perspective, and radar was starting to really become an important technology because there were so many planes in the skies at that point, and even more so today, and we need to know where they are, how fast they're traveling, what height they're traveling, particularly when you're coming into these hubs like London, where you've got multiple airports, where you will have probably at any one time dozens of planes in the sky, taking off, landing in holding patterns. You need to know where they are, and you need to be able to coordinate that. And of course, it isn't just planes. We still use it for shipping. We use it actually for monitoring speeds of cars and automobiles. And actually, it's even used in space. Radar is used in space for detecting satellites, rockets, and spacecraft. It's a phenomenal technology that we are still exploring, but harnessing.
And I guess the most important for most people would be the weather radar.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Which, of course, radar, one of the main reasons that radar was being developed at the time was to help aircraft to avoid electrical storms in particular. But yes, it's quite an incredible technology.
Many thanks for joining me today. Well, it's been fantastic, enlightening discussion on radar as a genius item, acoustic mirrors, not so, unfortunately, on the junk pile of history. And join us next time for more Genius or Junk.
So, another 2 innovations are consigned to their fate. But do you agree? Genius or Junk is an Oski Films production, created by James Fowler and Jamie Loudon. Visit our website, www.oskifilms.co.uk, to find out how we can help you with all your video and podcasting needs.